Trade. It's why we have so much communication with each other. It's the reason why we live the way we do today. In fact, companies didn't realize that they could 100x, 200x their companies simply by going overseas. And when the internet came and made it so easy that we realized that it's always been the key to life. That's why most countries around the world don't spend most of their time worrying about foreigners and what the problem with foreigners is. In fact, everybody's trying to create harmony between themselves and other people. Otherwise, we would live in the same colonization hellhole that we lived in a couple hundred years ago. No trade is more important than the one that happened in the Indian Ocean. Maybe the one that happened in the Atlantic Ocean, but we'll see. Let's first think about the people who lived in the Indian Ocean. We have the Egyptians trading through the Indian Ocean, the Ethiopians, the Indians, the Arabs, the Indonesians, and all the others. We have actual writing from people who talk about these trade routes and these trade times. And I've gone through some of these before, but never in an extensive, full video. And I think that's very important for us to do, to sit down and talk about why it's important to not ignore the Indian Ocean and its trade routes. Now, I want us to first start with something very important, which is how far away is two parts of the world. For example, Ethiopia and China, they're quite far from each other. Now, being far doesn't mean they will never contact each other. For example, many Chinese scholars would be fully aware of stuff that came from Africa because they would run into it in the Middle East. They would look up at it and think, where the hell did that giraffe come from? Pictures like these should remind us that there was deep travel all over the world, and people in China and Africa everywhere were quite curious about places. In fact, if we read from Ibn Battuta about China, we will see that his curiosity, even though he was an African, was too much. And when he got to China, he detailed things. And remember, this is what I was saying about the dictionary from the Kingdom of Congo. There's always a slip of perspective, a sudden change in perspective when you get someone who's not from a specific area telling you about that area. For example, what Marco Polo is going to say about China is going to be very different than someone who grew up in Africa. And this is very important information, not for any other reason but the fact that we get multiple confirmation of single points. And this is what we are going to get from these people. Because of a concept called 100%ism, some people will roll their eyes when they hear the word Ibn Battuta and think, isn't that just another Arab trader? Nope, he definitely was not, because he was an African. He was an Arab, but so were a lot of Africans. And he was a speaker of the Arabic language and he was a practitioner of Islam. But that changes nothing in the fact that you can have a completely different perspective than anybody else in the world. No matter what Ibn Battuta looked like, keep in mind this is a true African perspective. This guy came directly from Northwest Africa, and he had kinship, he had friendship with other people who were in Africa. In fact, in his homeland, he states that there were black Africans, and some of them accompanied him around the world. So, remember, this is a true African perspective. When you read what he says, he's comparing it to his own country, which easy trade was with other Africans. Now, of course, before you can even go to China, you have to go through places like the Middle East. And in fact, here he goes through Turkey, where the Turkmen are. Now, remember, the Turkmen are spread through a wide range of the Middle East, going from Russia, Turkey, and all the way to China. But this is what he had to say. The city of Alalaya that we have mentioned is a place on the sea coast. It is inhabited by Turkmens and is visited by the merchants of Cairo, Alexandria, and Syria. It has quantities of wood, which is exported from there to Alexandria and Dimyat, and thence carried to the other parts of Egypt. There is at the top of the town a magnificent and formidable citadel built by the illustrious Sultan Ala al-Din al-Rumi. I met in the city its Qadi Jalal al-Din al-Arzanjani. He went up to the citadel with me on Friday, when we performed the prayers there, and treated me with generous hospitality. I was hospitably entertained there also by Shams al-Din ibn al-Rajihani, whose father Ala al-Din died at Mali in the Negro lands. Well, what can we draw from that? Well, first of all, we can draw that traveling from one part of the earth to the other was something that was difficult but not impossible at the time. In fact, we see just people who are born elsewhere dying in random places around the world, and we see all kinds of stuff like that of people traveling and trading and doing all kinds of things that would make it very common and obvious at the time. But here's a humorous statement. Well, I find it funny because, a lot of people like to make it seem like this guy was like some deep Muslim who didn't have an ego. But this is what he had to say about one of the greatest travelers of his time. I met in the city the pious Sheikh Abdallah al Misri, the traveler and a man of saintly life. He journeyed through the earth, but he never went into China, nor the island of Ceylon, nor the Maghreb, nor Al Andalus, nor the Negrolands, so that I have outdone him by visiting these regions. See, you see there that he makes it very obvious that he takes great pride in the fact that he has traveled these places. And he talks about people. Now, keep in mind, Abdallah al Misri is probably mixed race, probably half Buja and half Arab, but we'll talk about that later in another part where he speaks. I hope so far I've made it quite obvious to you that I'm going to talk about the journey with black Africans traveling with him and traveling very far with him all the way to China and India and places like that. And I want you to pay attention to the fact that he himself, as a traveler, is needing permission to travel these places. He's not just some guy who just disrespectfully gets on boats and moves, and wherever he goes he needs the permission of the locals. And so of course he starts in the Negrolands, because why? He's from the Negrolands. He's from Morocco, which was one of the Negrolands that he writes down. So we're backing up a little here. We're going to talk about people like the Ethiopians and stuff before we start talking about how he traveled out. So remember, we let's talk about Asia Minor, which is the Turkish areas, then talk about Arabia Felix, which is Yemen. This is going to be important because this is how they're written down, the names, and then the Buja, which are the Beja. Now remember, this happened in the 1300s, which 300 years later in the 1600s the Portuguese would travel to the exact same spot and then need the same assistance of these people. So this guy needs the assistance of these Africans to travel to Asia Minor and to Arabia Felix and to India, the same way that the other people who came in, the Europeans who came in, needed the assistance of these people, because these people understood the winds of the areas. They weren't just standing there. From Upper Egypt, its inhabitants are the Buja, black-skinned people who wrap themselves in yellow blankets and tie headbands. each about a finger breadth wide, round their heads. They give daughters no share in their inheritance. Their food is camel's milk, and they ride on married dromedaries, which they call by the name of Sub. 1/3 of the city belongs to the Sultan of Egypt, al-Malik al-Nasser, and 2/3 to the king of the Buja, who is called al-Hadrabi. In the town of Idab there is a mosque attributed to al-Kastalini, famous for its blessed power. I saw it and visited it to profit by its blessing. In this town, too, live the pious Sheikh Musa and the aged Sheikh Muhammad al-Marrakesh, who declares that he is the son of the al-Martuda, the king of Marrakesh, and that he is 95 years of age. On reaching Idab, we found that al-Hadrabi, the Sultan of the Buja, was engaged in hostilities with the Turks, that he had sunk their ships, and the Turks had fled before him. It is impossible for us to make the sea crossing, so we sold the provisions that we had made ready and returned to Upper Egypt with the Arabs from whom we had hired the camels. Arrived back at the town of Kos, which has already been mentioned, we sailed thence down the Nile. It was the flood season, and after a passage of 8 nights from Kos, arrived at Cairo. Very interesting for me that these black inhabitants play such an important role. But if you were to Google what role black people played during the 1300s in the Middle East or Middle Eastern related cities, they would say nothing. When we know that they were in Arabia Felix, Asia Minor, and all places. In fact, I read to you the other time, which I'm not going to put it in this one, about the black inhabitant Negro who was all the way in Persia. But we have more important business to tend to because we're about to talk about him moving from Arabia into these areas, moving from Africa into the Arabian areas, and then hopefully for him into India, because only when he did that he could brag that he had traveled from the Negrolands all the way to China. When the pilgrimage ended, I went to Judah with the intention of sailing to Al Yaman and India, but that was not decreed for me. I was unable to find a companion, and I stayed in Judah about 40 days. There was a ship there belonging to a man called Abdallah al-Tunisi, who was intending to go to Al-Qusr in the government of Kus. So I boarded it to see what state it was in. But it did not please me, and I disliked the idea of traveling by it. This was an act of providence of God Most High. For the ship sailed, and when it was in an open sea, it foundered at a place called Ras Abu Muhammad. Its master and some merchants escaped in a ship's boat after severe distress and were on the point of death. Even some of these perished, and all the rest were drowned, including about 70 of the pilgrims who were on it. Some time later I sailed to Sumbak for Idab, but the wind drove us back to roadstead called Ras Dawar, and from there we traveled by the land with the Buja. We made our way through the desert full of ostriches and gazelles, and inhabited by Arabs of Juwana and Banu Kahil, who are subject to the Buja, and reached a water point called Mufr and another called Ja al Jadid. Since our provisions were exhausted, we purchased sheep from some of the Buja whom we found in the wilderness and prepared a store of their flesh. Long story short, they accompanied him to Asia Minor. But there's something else that is important about this story, which is you can see here that Arabs keep moving from one place to another. The son of the king of Marrakesh is in lower Egypt. The random person is here, this other person is here in another part that I'm not gonna show. People are learning in Syria who are from Egypt, people are learning from Egypt who are in Syria. It's just a thing of travel back and forth. And this is why it was possible for someone like this African, to travel all the way to places like China. You even saw there that there was another traveler whose name was Altuniz from Tunisia, who was traveling and was going to accompany him through the thing until his boat kind of floundered and died. But you could see that there's a guy from Tunisia which is close to where Morocco is. But what's he doing here? Trying to travel the world as well. A different person from the same similar location. That's why I laugh when people say that in Arabia it was just this thing where only 1,000 people moved into North Africa. No, that didn't happen. Of course, he went through Persia because, of course, Persia is close to India. And when he was in Persia, he saw the coal black Negro. But then when he was also in Persia, he met another person who is called the Black. And his name was Ahmad al Dinwari, Sheikh Ahmad al Dinwari, who, if we read, it says, Abdallah Amwa, he it was who was the disciple of the Sheikh Ahmad al Dinwari, the Black, without any intervening person, but God knows best. The person who became the disciple of Aku Faraj al Zinjani was Abdallah b Muhammad b Abdallah, the father of Abdal Najib. The many islands in between Africa and India connect them. One of them is called the Maldives. These Maldives, in the section called Southern Arabia, East Africa, and the Persian Gulf, talks about a trade where you find East Africans, the Maldives, and Indians playing a role. And it says, the coconut, especially that in the island of Dibat al Mahal, or the Maldives, is the size of a human head, and they tell this story. A certain philosopher in India in past ages was in the service of the kings and was held by high esteem. When large quantities of this sap has collected for him, he cooks it in the same way as grape juice is cooked when he rubs and made it makes a delicious honey and great utility, and this is brought by merchants of India, Al Yemen, and China, who transport it to their countries and manufacture sweetmeats from it. Now, I want you to remember a couple things about this specific area. Abraha, remember, in the 6th century, took over Yemen for the Christian king of Ethiopia and refused to give back the kingdom, instead ruling by himself. But this was one of the times, it's not the only, because I just read to you right there about the Buja as well, which are the Beja. You see this a lot, this slip of alphabet. This is why it's interesting to get it from multiple angles. But to go straight to what they talk about, you get the Buja, you get the 6th century people. Since the 6th century, the Ethiopians. So there's been Ethiopians in Yemen forever. And by the time this is happening, Ethiopians are basically typical in Yemen. And so when you say that the Maldives was frequented by these people, remember Yemen is right next to Somalia, it's right next to the Abyssinian regions, and this trade between all three of them would have definitely touched Ethiopia. Not to mention that um, there's places like Aramata where the Indians used to trade there anyway. So we're talking about a large network of trade, which includes these random islands right in the middle. And of course, this is only one person, which I'm not going to go into the other people today because there's like 10 or 20 books on other Islamists who talk about trade going throughout the entire region of the Indian Ocean. Okay, so this is just part one, but I will make a part two, and I hope I can make it 1 hour long. But every time I try to do something 1 hour, I realize that there's more important things to talk about. But for now, I want you to know that at some point, when Ibn Battuta goes to the Maldives, he has to rescue or intercede in the case of a Negro slave. And that's how you know that there were some Negroes in that area. People don't even know what people from Maldives are because they haven't been investigated that well. We know that they speak an Indo-European language.
As a reminder, although imported ceramics to Southern Africa and the Cape is part of our history, African ceramics are, of course, diverse in style, and we have a long, long history spanning thousands of years of beautiful, innovative ceramic objects that have been made in Africa. And I've chosen the Knock sculpture, which is so iconic. And of course, many members would know the Lydenburg heads, the 7 Lydenburg heads, of which one is illustrated here, from Lydenburg in the present-day Mpumalanga province. And I've also chosen a domestic vessel, beautifully decorated with arrows and zigzag patterns, also from the Mpumalanga area, but from 1946. So this is just to tell us, to remind us that we have this very, very rich history in Africa. Asian trade ceramics, of course, arrived before colonial times, and I've selected a few shards from the Izika collection. They were collected in the Zimbabwe area. They were not scientifically excavated, but we have them in our collection. They arrived in the collection in the late 19th century. There is the Celadon, Chinese Celadon fragment, Persian ceramic fragments, and underglaze blue porcelain fragments from the Yuan to the Ming dynasties. So, of course, Africa was very much connected to the Indian Ocean world, and archaeological excavations at ancient trading sites such as Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe has proven that we've had those connections going back many, many years.
When we talk about ancient trade routes like the Silk Road, we forget that the Silk Road was extended so far and wide as to touch the southern tips of Africa. And like those great civilizations that are in Africa, pre-colonial civilizations, we find things in China that were made in Africa, such as golden ornaments and coins with Africans on them. Also in China, there are depictions of dark-skinned people, and a lot of these people are thought to have moved or have been moved in through the Middle Eastern trade routes that linked Africa to East Asia. Now, some people believe that Africans founded the dynasties of China. This is not what this is about. I'm not going to claim something like that. To me, that's kind of outrageous, especially given the fact that some of the civilizations in Africa do not predate these Chinese civilizations. But it's obvious that the Chinese were very familiar with the direction of the Africans because there are maps drawn up by Chinese people which depict the African continent. And not only that, they depict African people, as you see in these figurines, pretty accurately. And they know which direction they come from. They even have names for these people. And these are different than the native black people which are around Asia. These people are specifically known because of their direction and where they fit on the map and where they came from. This map depicts 3 areas. One is Japan, parts of Japan. The other is Asia, wholly Asia. The other is Africa, and it shows parts of Eurasia. Interestingly, Europe is completely left out. Now, Kunyun or Kunlun was the name that they gave to African slaves or Africans, but then they started associating it with African slaves. And there's even a book that is about a slave that becomes an immortal that was written in ancient China and was revised in the 1500s and became how he became an immortal.
当我们想到古代中国时，许多人认为它是一个文化上与世隔绝的地方。在我们印象中，古代中国人以他们的技术、艺术、文学为傲，不关心外部世界。当然，丝绸之路促进了一定程度的文化交流，虽然这个时期的对话者多来自中亚、日本、韩国和东南亚。但是中国与黑人的接触呢？古代中国人对黑人的了解是可信的吗？根据历史资料，好像他们确实是了解的。今天我们将讨论古代中国人眼中的黑人，以及非洲人在中国领土上的第一个有纪律的证据。
中国文献中最早涉及黑人的是公元前5世纪莫迪的著作。莫迪在他的哲学论集《墨子》中区分了一些人和其他人，一些人指的就是黑人。稍后的著作《山海经》里，黑人被描述为有着虎头鸟足的生物，然而这说的都不是非洲人，黑不过是指华夏帝国周边的蛮夷之族。直到很晚，我们才开始看到一些参考文献中的黑人指的是非洲人。昆仑人作为一个新的人种分类，逐渐地被用于描述有着黑色皮肤的外国人。这个词开始被广泛使用是在公元7世纪，广州都督陆元瑞被一个据说是马来西亚后裔的外国商人所杀之后。唐宋年间，昆仑的疆域被认为不仅包括东南亚，甚至远至非洲东海岸。昆仑代表了一大批不同种族的外国人。从12世纪的作家朱玉的作品中，我们可以看到昆仑人之间的区别。在他的《平洲可谈》一书里，记载了一种昆仑人比任何其他的人种都要强壮。在他的笔下，这种昆仑人有红色的嘴唇、白色的牙齿和墨黑的皮肤，而且他们是被阿拉伯商人带来的，一般被卖给广州地区富贵家庭做佣人。学者们认为这些昆仑人就是非洲人，但是我们怎么知道这是真的？1930年，中国学者张新良写了一本书，追溯到唐朝，证明了昆仑一词曾被用作一个广义的术语，但是对于特定的人群，更专业的术语是层期。这两个词是阿拉伯语中 zinj 在中文里的音译，本意为黑。这是昆仑人被阿拉伯商人作为货物带到中国最清楚的证据。
As easy as it should be to spot the difference between an African and a Chinese person, there's still a hangover of who or when Black Africans landed in China. The earliest we do know is that it must have been East Africans who actually have wrote about those areas, including places like ancient Egypt, which were aware of places very, very far away. Somewhere in 200 BC and going forward, the emperors and adventurers of China thought of going to a place which they called Daqin, which means second China. This place is thought to have been Greece or Rome. When they traveled that direction, they found it impossible to get there, especially since there were so many merchants who had ulterior motives from the Middle East. The Middle East has always been familiar with Egypt, China, India, and Rome. Everybody else was in the outskirts, and so they were only partially aware of each other. One day, the Chinese finally made it to Daqin, and they depict all kinds of narratives about the Romans and the Greeks. They too observed ancient Egyptians, or Egyptians at that time, and noticed that there were people of extremely dark color. Later on, as the story goes on, we have people like Alexander and the Islamic merchants who became way more familiar or familiarized the Chinese way more with darker skinned people. Now, these darker skinned people were different than other darker skinned people which they're familiar with, which were the Indians. Even the Indians were shocked by the appearance of the Africans, though there are other people around India that have that appearance. But to know that it was so abundant in other places was a shock. In the court of Kublai Khan, after Genghis Khan and his dynasty that lasted a very short time, but expanded far and wide, Kublai Khan found himself somewhere close to Europe. And in his court, we have depictions of Europeans, mainly from Rome, and we also have depictions of Africans, black Africans. Luckily, these places did not fall under the reign of Kublai Khan. In fact, Kublai Khan dynasty, his entire lineage crawled all the way back to China. Finding out that the world was so big was one of the biggest things ever. In the 1200s, the Khans did damage, but in the 1300s, the information that the Khans had kept was a curiosity to the Chinese. And so they wondered, how big is the world really? And so Zheng He traveled all the way to East Africa to find out.
郑和前3次的航行到了越南、爪哇和斯里兰卡以及印度，只有1413年的第4次航行中，他才间接地抵达了非洲。那是在伊朗的霍尔木兹海峡，郑和见到了来自索马里首都摩加迪沙的商人。然而，对于郑和和他的同行者，这次见面最神奇的地方在于，他们有机会看到长颈鹿，一种他们从没见过的生物。1414年，郑和的船队带着长颈鹿和几个非洲的自由人返回中国，以向皇帝朝贡。1417年，郑和船队的第5次远航在非洲登陆。位于非洲东海岸的这些航行，最权威的记录来自于随军翻译官费信。他虽然不是郑和船队里热情的追随者，但他提供了关于这群人航行最准确、最有启发性的记录。同样重要的是，这些记录帮助我们了解中国人怎么看待15世纪东非人的生活。
This is Siyu village, located in the northeast of Kenya. Legends among local people speaks of a story that more than 600 years ago, survivors from a sunken Chinese ship found their way here and married to the local beauties. People who live in the house you're seeing behind me was proved to have Chinese genetics.
According to legends, a team of Chinese sailors survived a shipwreck in the Indian Ocean waters and settled in Lamu Island. Historians contend that the sailors were part of a fleet sent by the legendary Chinese navigator Zheng He. 6 centuries later, the descendants of these Chinese sailors are visible in Lamu, where China's ancient maritime Silk Road terminates. In Siyu village, archaeologists have discovered artifacts like porcelain and coins that were symbols of the Ming dynasty.
This is some pieces of Chinese porcelain here. When I walk around, you will meet these things. There are many steel pieces. When you walk around, you'll see the small pieces. So I found it here in Siyu.
Mwamaka and her family are among the ones who are a living testimony of the earliest contacts between Kenya and China. It was in 2002 that a team of distinguished Kenyan and Chinese researchers carried a DNA analysis on Mwamaka's 63-year-old mother and discovered that she has Chinese genetics.
They came and we welcomed them for a stay, and they took some hair of us for texting to ensure that we are one of them.
Soon afterwards, the Chinese government offered Mwamaka a scholarship to study Chinese traditional medicine in China. Kenyan and Chinese archaeologists have been tracing evidence of ancient contacts in the Kenyan coast. They hope to find the shipwreck to help unearth all artifacts symbolizing ancient cultural and trade ties.
East Africa, from the northern parts to the central areas of Kilwa, as seen in these videos, and down to the south, is a very interesting area of study. Now, if we focus first on Kilwa, what we can see is that there was a general and a acceptance of excellence in this region. We don't need to, but I could show an image of it. But people like Ibn Battuta mentioned that the majority of this population were jet black. Now, does that mean anything to anybody? Well, to me it means a lot, and I'll tell you why. Because all the surrounding cities around this area, whether they were Muslim, Christian, or non-Muslim, had a similar lifestyle to those people. And I think the one I should start with is Somalia. We should start with Mogadishu. And of course some of you are going to say, why? Well, the reason is because Mogadishu is one of those places where we have historical records talking about people from Mogadishu going as far as Korea, because Muslims traveled as far as Korea, and using that type of knowledge, we know that in isolated incidences, they made it all the way to Japan. If you understand what I'm saying, I'm telling you that the Muslims of East Africa traveled in the 9th century. Hear what I'm saying? In the 9th century, they traveled to Korea, and there's written record both in Korea and in Muslim records. Now, Mogadishu was found in the 10th century, but it was not a vacant spot before the city was named Mogadishu and basically altered to become as successful as it became. So, what we have to talk about is 3 people. Right now, I'm going to talk about 3 people, and I'm going to show you written records that show these 3 people are called Mogadishu. Mogadishu is the real word of Mogadishu, well, the Arabic word of Mogadishu, and they show that one of them, who's a jurist, is in China. Remember how old this is. We're not talking about 1700s, we're not talking about 1600s, we're talking about 1100s to about the 1300s. One of them is in China. One of them is off of an island near India, and the other one is somewhere in Africa, but is shown to play a giant role in transporting people around the world. Why is that important? Well, the reason why that's important is because after that we have all these other islands like Madagascar, and we start seeing other people from those islands as well doing the same thing, meaning that East Africa in general, probably more than other places in the world, is more fascinating in its abilities at the time. It didn't matter what religion they worshipped. A lot of them were pagan. A lot of them were not Muslim at all, who lived both in Mogadishu, Kilwa, Mombasa, Sofala, Great Zimbabwe, and more. Yet they pushed for advancement, because some people don't understand that the Bantu religions were competing and holding their ground against modern religions at the time. Mogadishu, which is a town of enormous size, its inhabitants are merchants possessed of vast resources. They own large numbers of camels, of which they slaughter hundreds every day for food, and also have quantities of sheep. In this place are manufactured the woven fabrics called after it, which are unequaled and exported from it to Egypt and elsewhere. It is custom of the people of this town that when a vessel reaches the anchorage, the sumbuks, which are small boats, come out to it. In each sumbuk there are a number of young men of the town, each one of whom brings a covered platter containing food and presents it to one of the other merchants on the ship, saying, "This is my guest," and each of the others does the same. The merchants, on disembarking, goes only to the house of his host among the young men, except those of them who have made frequent journeys to the towns and have gained some acquaintance with its inhabitants. These lodge where they please. When he takes up residence with his host, the latter sells his goods for him and buys for him, and if anyone buys anything from him at too low a price or sells to him in the absence of his host, that sale is held invalid by them. This practice is a profitable one for them. So that's just a small description by Ibn Battuta, 1300s, of Mogadishu, and you can see that's a very organized place. It's not just a place that exists where you're like, oh, it's, you know, the houses are loosely resemble civilization or whatever. We're talking about a large infrastructure, a large settlement that is really the envy of the world for a lot of Arabs. And in fact, a lot of Arabs wanted it to be part of their domain, part of their steads. Before we move on to Kilwa and how they were mentioned, let's first mention the three people from Mogadishu. I just wanted to show you that that word is exactly the same as Mogadishu, that these people are explained in this. So it says here, I met in this mosque a pious jurist from Mogadishu called Saeed, of fine figure and character. He used to fast continually, and I was told that he studied at Mecca for 14 years, and for the same length of time at Al-Madinah had met Abu Namir and Amir of Mecca and Mansur Jamaz, the Amir of Al-Madinah, and had traveled in India and China. Before I read the next one, I want to direct your attention to the map at the side. You can see there it's written the Maldives. So, like I said, we're going to look at a different Mogadishu, person from Mogadishu, And I want you to look at that place written Maldives. You see that it's closer to India than it is to Africa. So we're going to read right now. This is a reading from Ibn Battuta. I opened the Quran and found the angels will descend to them, saying, do not be afraid and do not grieve. I asked God's blessing and set out. After 10 days, I reached the Maldive Islands and landed in Kanalus. Its governor, Abd al-Aziz of Mogadishu, treated me with honor, offered me hospitality, and prepared a kandura for me. After I reached Hululi, which is the island to which the Sultana and her sisters go to relax and swim. So you can see here the second one, and this is why I'm telling you that Mogadishu was just at this time related 100% to places like India and China. It was an easy move for them to go there. We have two people. One went to China just to visit. The other one is a sultan, but he was of Mogadishu, but he was a sultan of the Maldives, which are close to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, which is what Sri Lanka used to be called. So this is the difference, right? Africa used to just travel to China and all these places. And like I said before, the Portuguese, when they traveled to Japan, they enlisted the help of the East Africans, because the East Africans understood the winds and the oceans at the time, because they had traveled back and forth. And you could take 3 years to go to India if you go in the wrong season, meaning that the winds are going to blow you back and back and back, and then when you finally get there, you're like, what the hell? Meanwhile, in other cases, it could take you, I don't know, a couple weeks, couple days, if you go at the right time and let the winds push you there. Now that's all fine and dandy, but how far back does this go? Well, in order to find this out, we have to go to Al-Masudi. This is trying to draw this similarity or this connection between India, China, and the Abyssinians or Mogadishu. Like I said, Mogadishu was founded in the 10th century, but before this, there was still Abyssinia, who go back a couple thousands of years, which you can see is written about by Al-Masudi, who writes, estimates have been made respecting the extent of the Indian Sea, which is identical with the Abyssinian Sea. Its length from the most western part of Abyssinia as far as China in the east is 8,000 miles, and its breadth is in one place 2,700, and in another 1,900 miles, for it varies in different places. These dimensions have been disputed, but we will not enter into the different statements, because there are no proofs upon which they rest. This is the greatest sea of the habitable world. It has a gulf extending from Abyssinia as far as the Barbaria, a country situated between the territory of the Zanj and the Abyssinians. This gulf is called the Barbarian Gulf. It is 500 miles long, and at the beginning and end 100 miles wide. These are not the Berbers who live west of Africa, for that is a different country altogether. It has the same name, although it has the same name. The sailors of Oman go on this sea as far as the island of Kanbalu, in the sea of the Zanj. This island is inhabited by Muslims and by Zanj, who have not embraced the Islam. The sailors of Oman, to whom we have just alluded, believe that this gulf, which is called the Barbarian Gulf, and with them the sea of the Berbers and of the country of Jofuni, is much greater than we have said. The waves of the sea are huge, like high mountains. Okay, so we don't need to read really any further, but I will. Anyone who's not interested can skip, but I think we should read this whole thing. These are blind waves. This term means waves which rise as high as mountains and between which abysses open like the deepest valleys, but they do not break. Hence, no foam is created like that produced by the collision of the waves in the other seas. They believe that these waves are enchanted. The sailors of Oman who sail on this sea are Arabs of the tribe of El Azd, and when they are on the board a ship, sometimes lifted up by these waves, and then again sinking between them, they say verses whilst they are at work, as O Barbaria and Jofuni, and thy enchanted waves, Jofuni and Barbaria, and their waves, as thou seest them. These sailors go on the sea of Ezanj as far as the island of Kanbalu and Sofala of the Demdema, which is on the extremity. Now, I want to be clear about this. This is another connection between the extremities, because Oman is very far away from Africa, but close to India again. Still sticking to al-Masudi, we continue as we see him talk about these people in more detail, and you'll notice how by this time we already are seeing, the connection between India and all these other places, which, by the way, was mentioned in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. We're talking about a couple hundreds of years back before this moment. So this isn't even the earliest. This is just showing you these specific kingdoms. Okay, so let's just start here. It proceeds flowing through that part of the country of Sudan which borders on the country of the Zanj, and a branch goes off it into the sea of the Zanj. This is the sea of the island Kanbalu, which is cultivated, and the inhabitants are Muslims, but they speak the Zanji language. The Mohammedans have conquered this island and made the inhabitants prisoners, just as they have taken the Isle of Crete. So you see here, they're talking about a native population that converted to Islam, and they still speak a Zanji language. They don't speak Arabic, and they basically have converted the people of this island into Muslims. But you could tell with other things, this place was already sophisticated before they got there. It's just now with the introduction of Islam, it goes in an Islamic bend. The comparison with Crete is not a small one, because of course the same thing happened to Crete, even though Crete has a civilization that goes back a couple thousand years. And of course the inhabitants of Crete are mixed. But let's first come back to a certain point. Everything I've mentioned so far has nothing to do with Portuguese. The Portuguese haven't landed in these areas yet. Everything I'm talking about is two groups that are in this region. One, the black native Africans, and two, the foreign Arabs, and they're a minority. Well, how do I know? Well, we can read it from Ibn Battuta. A couple of things to keep in mind while reading this is, even in the time of al-Masudi, the 900s, you could tell that the majority of the population was still Zanj, and they were speaking Zanji languages. And now we're going to read from Ibn Battuta, which is from the 1300s. And so we see here, if one intends to make an ablution, he holds a vessel between his thighs and pours on his hands and performs the ritual washing. All the people walk with bare feet. We stayed one night in this island and sailed on to the city of Kulwa, a large city on the seacoast, most of whose inhabitants are Zinj. jet black in color. They have tattoo marks on their faces, just as there are on the faces of the, which is not important, but it basically tells you that. So we go from Mogadishu to another island. He's probably speaking about Kanbula, but with a different name, and then to Kulwa or Kilwa, and he talks about how the people of Kilwa are jet black, the majority. But remember, Kilwa was not settled during Ibn Battuta's time. It happened before that, even before Masudi, who is hundreds of years before Ibn Battuta. So this is a long held area, and the population did not change for hundreds of years. And even today, I mean, still black people. And estimates say there was 11,000 people living on this island. So let's just read the whole thing quickly. I then sailed from the city of Mogadishu, that was the main point, making for the country of the Swahilis, with the object of visiting the city of Kulwa in the land of the Zinj people. We came to the island of Mombasa, a large island 2 days' journey of the Sea of Swahili country. It has no mainland territory, and its trees are the banana, the lemon, the citron. Its people have a fruit which they call jamun, resembling an olive and with a stone like its stone. The inhabitants of this island sow no grain, and it has to be transported to them from the Swahili. The food consists mostly of bananas and fish. They are Shafits in right, pious, honorable, and upright, and their mosques are made of wood, admirably constructed at each of the gates of the mosques. There are 1 or 2 wells, and they draw up water from them in a wooden vessel into which has been fixed a thin stick of length of 1 cubit. The ground round the well and the mosque is paved. Anyone who intends to go into the mosque washes his feet, and then we get back to where I started. But this is Kulwa, this is the coast. And remember, this coast is still connected to India, China, ultimately Korea. Abu Ishaq Ibrahim ibn Muhammad al-Farisi al-Istakri was a person who was a map maker and a writer of history, and he wrote a couple books about different cities around the world, including some of the ones that we've already talked about. But he is the oldest person to write about Korea, meaning that we know that Korea was connected with the Muslim world. And not only that, we know that there were several Muslims in Korea who were living at the time. And the funny part is we have Eastern documents of this, meaning we have documents in Korea of this as well. But first, let's read UNESCO. This is from UNESCO. Of 20 writings by 11 Muslim scholars of the medieval age concerning Silla, 10 sources by 9 scholars, Ibn Khaldun, Masudi, and others, contain records of advance of Muslims onto the Korean peninsula and their activities. The oldest extant record being not only the first remark on the Korean peninsula, but also a mention of a settlement of Muslims on the Korean peninsula, is Ibn Khaldun's General Survey of Roads and Kingdoms. The book, seemingly with the first edition in 846 to 847, and the second edition in 885 respectively, was something like an official guide book of geography, being the oldest bibliographical source in geography extant today. The book contains detailed information about major places of settlement, trading routes, and trading goods in many parts of the world. It also contains comprehensive knowledge about East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and the like. Two passages about the advance made by Muslim to the Korean peninsula and their settlement are as follows, though their contents are somewhat similar to one another. Beyond China, across from Kansu, there is a country with many mountains called Silla. It abounds in gold. Muslims who happen to go there were fascinated by the good environment and tend to settle there for good. There is no way of knowing what lies beyond there. Beyond China, there is a country abounding in gold called Silla. Muslims who advance there, captivated by its congenial surroundings, tend to settle there for good and do not think of leaving the place. The second Muslim scholar who mentioned the settlement of the Muslims in Korea after Ibn Qurtuba was Ibn Rushd. In Catalogue of Precious Goods, he wrote with little explanation that beyond China there is a country called Silla which abounds in gold, and that Muslims once settled there do not think of leaving. His expressions is similar to Ibn Qurtuba General Survey of Roads and Kingdoms concerning Silla. Like Yaqubi ibn al-Faqih, Kadama, Jahiz, Yad Hajan, and the like, Ibn Rushd seem to have been very much influenced by the writings of Ibn Qurtuba. There are more detailed and factual accounts on Muslims living in Silla in two writings by Masudi, The Golden Step and Gem Mines, and Learnings and General Survey, published 1 century later, following General Survey of Reading and Kingdoms. Masudi identified the Muslims living in Silla, and according to him, some of them were Iraqis. Across the coast of China, not much is known except for Silla and its accompanying islands. Iraqis and some other foreigners settled there, choosing the place as their homeland. They do not intend to leave the place because of its fresh air, clean water, fertile earth, prospect for the increase of profit and income, rich minerals, and rich gems. Those who leave the place are quite few. So that's from UNESCO. For those of you who are paying attention, you would have seen that there was a mention of al-Masudi. Now, the reason I didn't bring him up first was because he's not the earliest to write about this area, but he does mention it. And we can read here, because of course they said Silla was the name of Korea, and we will read here. There are wonderful accounts reported respecting the Sea of China and those which are in connection with it. We refer the reader to our books on these subjects, which we have frequently had occasion to bring under his notice. Beyond the coast of China is no other kingdom known or described excepting the country of Es-Sabal, Japan, and Es-Silla, Korea, and the islands which belong to it. No one from Iraq or any other place of the West frequents this country. The air of this country is wholesome, the water good, the soil fertile, and the precious stones are brilliant and genuine. Hence the country is rich, and it seldom happens that the inhabitants leave their native soil. They are allies of the Chinese, and the kings of both countries constantly exchange presents. So you'll notice there, it's not a slight understanding of Korea. This is a very deep understanding of Korea. And of course, like I showed you, al-Masudi, Ibn Battuta, and many others say that so on one side, the friendliest people of China are the Koreans, and then on the other side, another trade partner are the Sudan, basically the Zanj and the Abyssinians. This makes it the center of both of these places. in terms of trade. And you will see writings about wood and stuff being transported and all the other stupid stuff. But that's not important right now. One thing they do mention, though, is the difference between the boats that existed at the time, because Abyssinian boats and Zanj boats, a lot of the time, were built without nails because of corrosion. And, it was different for these other places. But this is the conclusion here. This early, they knew about Japan, and in fact went to Japan. Isolated incidences, it didn't make a big difference in the history of Japan, but they did go there. But something to keep in mind, which is very important, is that these writings are before Genghis Khan was even born. So these connections are not made because of the Mongols. In fact, the Mongols had never ventured beyond their areas, still being pushed back by the Chinese. And, obviously they went into China sometimes, they broke in, but there were still just these tribes in those areas. The Muslims had penetrated far into Japan and Korea. And remember, just like we see giraffes in China, pictures, paintings of giraffes in China, and of course exploration that would later happen by Zheng He. But remember, Zheng He is still later. He's not necessarily an example of the people who inspired the Abyssinians and the Zanj to go and trade with China. And so this is this is something they thought of themselves. So this is why it's not a surprise that by the time of the kingdom of Mozambique, and remember, Mozambique, I'm not talking about the Portuguese side of it, by the time of the kingdoms of Sena, the kingdom of Kilwa, the kingdom of Manigena, the kingdom of all these places that are Bantu regions, we find these Chinese pottery in this place. But this connection, though the Muslims write about it in the 900s, is actually earlier. Now, why would I say that? Well, it's because, they've dated the dates of some of these pottery, Chinese-made pottery, that this is not a version of what would have been there, but they have it, and it's in writing, and it's from the 7th century in Mozambique. Now, assumptions before first thought that it must have traveled from China to India to the Middle East, from Egypt to Mogadishu, from Mogadishu to the Swahili coast, from the Swahili coast to Mozambique. That's not what happened. It's easier today to believe that it went from China to the Zanj regions, including Mozambique directly, as that would be one of their trade partners. Unfortunately, because Mozambique at the time, in the 7th century, did not have any writing, it means that we will never fully understand what they saw. Who gave them these items? Was it literally these pale-skinned Chinese people getting off of boats and trading with them? And for what exactly? I mean, we do know because we have it in Chinese records, but we don't know from the point of view of the people of Mozambique. China tends to generalize East Africa. They don't tend to separate, but we do know that the word Zanj appears in Chinese records over and over again, meaning that they did deal directly with the Zanj when it came to trade. Remember, the word Zanj is just another word for Bantu people, but it's not all Bantu people. It's the Bantu people living in East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, Zambia, those regions. it's hard to know what the original people thought about what they saw, but later fragments would continue to come in, even into the later centuries. And so we read the later fragments of the Chinese. So it says here the minority categories of Chinese porcelain shards recovered can be placed in the early Qing period dating to the 17th and 18th century CE, and the late Qing period, 18th and 20th century CE, in the same archaeological context of Convent Sao Dimago. Was also found a variety of European tin glazed earthenware, such as blue on white and blue and green on gray, with a variety of decorative motifs, and blue or green transfer printed whiteware. The chronological and geographical distribution of the Chinese and European ceramics on Mozambique Island present key patterns within regional trade history. In the early phase of this trade, the 15th and 16th century, the most dominant ceramics seem to be Chinese porcelains, and are commonly associated with the global Sino-Swahili trade network. In the later period, the importation of European ceramics become more common, also involved the export of ivory, enslaved people, gold, timbers, pearls, seed pearls, ambergris, tortoise shells, animal skins, and local potteries to Portugal and other Western European countries and their Northern American colonies, which I think is a very important thing to talk about, to remember that before that, before the Europeans arrive, you don't see any ceramics from Europe. Zilch, zero. And then they arrive, you start to see them replace the Chinese ones, meaning that, as they write, it was a global Sino-Swahili trade network. Very important. While paintings that depict Chinese people holding giraffes with these long necks and everything, and you can see that they have full contact with these animals. So this is not speculation. They actually traded them. While this is fascinating in proving it, this is not the best thing they got from Africa. Africans had gold at the time, so they traded gold with the Africans for ceramics and other things. And of course, the animals were crazy to them. Like, how is this possible that there's animals that look like this that you do not find in China? So in conclusion, I actually want you in your head to imagine the scenario, and I think this perfect drawing, who I don't know who made it, but it's from the internet, will depict what type of world there was. You can see in the corner there's an Arab man staring at this African man who's holding a giraffe, and then there's obviously a king from China standing behind. And this is a perfect image because it tells you and it shows you how different the cultures, but when they come together, how, I don't know, awesome it might have looked in the heads of many. And we know this happened. This scenario, even though it's a modern painting, we know it absolutely happened because Ibn Battuta writes about it. Ibn Battuta writes about Africans who are literally in China while there are Muslims there, while there are, while there are Chinese people, obviously, because they're native to China, in China. So, and by the way, this is before the Portuguese ever were involved in any of this. No Europe, none of that, just straightforward. Now, I'm not saying there are no Muslim Europeans who traveled early. That did happen. I'm just saying it wasn't Europe proper. It wasn't colonizing Europe that took over Africa and all of that. This is prior to all of that. The world, it didn't seem obvious what direction the world was going. And I wish there was a painting of this type where it showed all the cultures in one region. except there is obviously with that Chinese one that I showed you, where the Chinese one shows Western empires, but that's not important for this video. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is a book that was written by an explorer from ancient Egypt, 1st century AD, and he wrote in Greek and wrote about the travels that a lot of people, including himself, had done, and he wrote as far as India and even China. Now, the problem with this is that China itself was somewhat ignorant of Africa and even Europe at this time, while Indian traders had been trading there since the 7th century BC. Evidence of Indians in Africa goes back years, centuries, and because of this, the Chinese were fully aware that there must have been other continents or even lands that lay beyond. So from the perspective of the Chinese, they needed to know what is on the other side of the Middle East. Sima Qian, a historian from China from BC, 100 BC, describes all these fascinating places in the Middle East, but his descriptions stop at Daqin, and Daqin, which is thought to be Greece or Rome, is not explored. It's said as something that he has heard of from other people. But he did talk about traveling to close areas in the Middle East. Something that is not written in the book of Sima Qian, which talks about the Western nations. Yezu, the people are settled on the land, cultivating the fields and growing rice and wheat. They also make wine out of grapes. They have walled cities like the people of Daiwan. The regions containing several hundred cities of various sizes. The kingdom, which borders the Gu River, is very large, measuring several thousand li squares. Some of the inhabitants are merchants who travel by carts or boats to neighboring countries, sometimes journeying several thousand li. The coins of the country are made of silver and bear the face of the king. When the king dies, the currency is immediately changed, and new coins issued with the face of his successor. The people keep records by writing horizontally on a strip of leather. To the west lies Tiazhao, or Mesopotamia, and to the north Yangsai and Liashan, Hirakan, or the Turkish regions. Tiazhao is situated several thousand li west of Angshi and borders the Western Sea, the Persian Gulf. It is hot and damp, and the people live by cultivating the fields and planting rice. In this region live great birds which lay eggs as large as pots. The people are very numerous and are ruled by many petty chiefs. The ruler of Angshi gives orders to these chiefs and regards them as his vassals. The people are skillful at performing tricks that amaze the eye. The old men of Angshi say they have heard that the Taozao are to be found in the river of the weak water and the Queen Mother of the West, though they admit that they have never seen either of them. Dakshia is situated 2,000 li southeast of Daiwan, south of the Gu River. Its people cultivate the land and have cities and houses. Their customs are like those of Daiwan. It has no great ruler, but only a number of petty chiefs ruling a various cities. The people are poor in the use of arms and afraid of battle, but they are clever at commerce. After the great Yezu moved west and attacked and conquered Dakshia, the entire country came under their sway. The population of the country is large, numbering some 1 million or some more persons. The capital is called the large city of Langshi or Bactra, and has a market where all sorts of goods are brought and sold. Southeast of Daxia is the kingdom of Shendu, or India. When I was in Daxia, Shang Qian reported, I saw bamboo canes from Chong and cloth made in the province of Shu. When I asked the people how they had gotten such articles, they replied, our merchants go to buy them at the markets of Shendu. Shendu, they told me, lies several thousand li southeast of Daxia. The people cultivate the land and live much like the people of Daxia. The region is said to be hot and damp. The inhabitants ride elephants when they go into battle. The kingdom is situated on a great river. We know that Daxia is located 12,000 li southwest of China. Now, if the kingdom of Shendu is situated several thousand li southeast of Daxia and obtains goods which are produced in Shu, it seems to me that it must not be very far away from Shu. At present, if we try to send envoys to Daxia by way of the mountain trails, the lead through the territory of the Qiang people, they will be molested by the Qiang, while if we send them a little further north, they will be captured by the Xiongnu. It would seem that the most direct route, as well as the safest, would be that out of Shu. Thus the emperor learned of Daiwan, Daxi, Anxi, and others, all great states rich in unusual products, whose people cultivate the land and made their living in much of the same way as the Chinese. All these states, he was told, were militarily weak and prized Han goods and wealth. He also learned that to the north of them lived the Yezu and Kangju, people who were strong in arms but who could be persuaded by gifts and the prospect of gain to acknowledge allegiance to the Han court. If it were possible to win over these states by peaceful means, the emperor thought, he could then extend his domain 10,000 li, attract to his court men of strange customs who would come translating and retranslating their languages, and his might would become known to all of the lands within the 4 seas. The emperor was therefore delighted and approved Shang Qian's suggestion. He ordered Shang Qian to start out from Juanwei in Shu on the secret mission to search for Daxia. The party broke up into 4 groups, proceeding out of the regions of Meng, Ran, Shi, and Qiong, and Po. All the groups managed to advance 1,000 or 2,000 li, but they were blocked on the north by the Di Zhao tribes, and on the south by the Sioux and Kunming tribes. The Kunming tribes have no rulers, but devote themselves to plunder and robbery, and as soon as they are seized, any of the Han envoys, they immediately murder them. Thus, none of the parties were ever able to get through to their destination. They did learn, however, that some 1,000 or more li to the west, there was a state called Dianwei, whose people rode elephants, and that the merchants of Shu sometimes went there with their goods on unofficial trading missions. In this way, the Han, while searching for the route to Daxia, first came into contact with the kingdom of Dian. Earlier, the Han had tried to establish relations with the barbarians of the southwest, but the expanse proved too great, and no road could be found through the regions, and so the project was abandoned. After Zhang Qian reported that it was possible to reach Daxia by traveling through the region of the southwestern barbarians, the Han once more began efforts to establish relations with the tribes in the area. Now, while that is an impressive amount of knowledge that Sima Qian shows, it's not new to the Chinese. The Chinese had known about Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, India, and other regions. I mean, as far as Japan, Korea, Indonesia, and all the rest by about the 7th century BC. So, and there's actually written records about this. So this isn't a revolutionary book. The thing that they were trying to do was to sum up what was happening so that they could go further than this point. Unfortunately, you can see right there that the people of the Middle East guarded their territory with all their might. And why would they do this? Why would they bother? Well, we do know that lying just on the other side of the Middle East, which the Chinese were fully ignorant of, are two great continents. These continents, of course, had been visited by the Indians, so the Indians were fully aware, and had the Chinese been more curious to ask the Indians how they made their way to these vast places, they would have had the knowledge greater than trying to walk through land, which probably seemed simpler at the time. But the two that lay on the other side were Africa and Europe. What would then happen after that is that explorers from China would try again and again and again to go beyond this area, failing a couple times. And of course, the Europeans would make their way into China very far back. In fact, there are Chinese books that go back about the same time as Sima Qian that talk about the explorers of China landing, or the explorers of Europe landing in China. Or at least they call them explorers from the West. Maybe they were from Europe, who knows? They could have been from Egypt. Now, a couple things. Obviously, we can't take everything that the sources say to heart, including Herodotus and all of them. We can't take every single thing they say to the fullest because, of course, they may misinterpret things. For example, I think a lot of the civilizations which they say dedicate themselves to robbery would definitely say, if coming from their perspective, they were not robbers or thieves, but instead were capturing certain foreigners and stuff like that who would infiltrate their territories and then rob them. But they were doing commerce within each other, and that you can't really have a state that is dedicated to robbery. In the same way that Herodotus describes the people of Egypt when he's talking about them doing their dances as, they try to make the most offensive dances, and they start to show certain parts of their body and stuff like that in offensive manner. I think from the perspective of the Egyptians that he's writing about, they wouldn't say that that's what they were doing. Like, hey, we're trying to offend people. In real life, because of course, who you gonna offend? They weren't doing it for the Romans; they were doing it for themselves. What they were really doing was just dancing, but the dance was so wild or unexpected compared to what the Greeks had seen that they describe it in a completely different manner. And this is one of the problems, and I'd say solutions, of history, in that it's a problem because obviously if you read one perspective, then you get one perspective, and then that's it, right? That's what you believe. But if you read multiple perspectives of the same encounter, what you then see is how other people see things that do not belong to their own customs. And of course, in ancient Egypt, they would consider themselves as highly organized, whereas Herodotus sort of shows that they're highly organized for the most part, but then starts to interpret things that he does not understand as chaos. Speaking of Herodotus, he is one of the great evidences that the people of India traded with Africa going far back. Because remember, in Herodotus's book, we have Indians stationed as close as the Red Sea, and we know in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea that Middle Eastern merchants would meet Indian boats at the Red Sea, which were trading with African boats. And we know during the Arabic times that the Arabs would allow Indian boats to trade with African boats unmolested. So drawing a map of what is really happening, you can see that the country that is left out, or the continent, or the whatever you want to call it, that is left out is not Africa. It's not even India. It's not Europe. It's not the Middle East. It's China. China, of course, still gaining a lot of the trade. I mean, rhino horns, we know, were making their way all the way to China, but this did not stop them from being completely ignorant of these places. And so we go to another Chinese person who too would fail to reach Africa or Europe. From the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, conceptualizing the far west, early Chinese notions of Dachin and the Indian Ocean trade. Now it's important to understand that Dachin didn't necessarily mean Rome as it's been interpreted today, but in fact could be a mix of several Western civilizations, that Western meaning west of China, which they did not know about. So obviously they would know, like, okay, these people are from the Middle East because they've run into Middle Easterners. But in some cases they would run into Africans, or they would run into a type of Middle Eastern group that they had never met before, you know, the ones that don't represent Persian or those near regions. And because of this, they would make the estimation that these people come from Dachin. But remember, a lot of these would be guesses, and a lot of these people who wrote about Dachin were hundreds of years apart, so they did not know if they were talking about the exact same location. In some cases, they would even be talking about Roman Egypt. So the people come from Roman Egypt and they say, oh, these are the people from Dachin. What does that mean? As we read, conceptualizing the far west, early Chinese notions of Dachin and the Indian Ocean trade by Matthew A. Cobb. In the Liang Shu, a 7th century Chinese history primarily covering the period 502 to 557 CE, a curious incident is reported about the arrival of a merchant called Qin Lu on the coast of Jiazhou in 226 CE, a region equating to the Red River Delta in Vietnam. This merchant, who is said to have been from Dachin, literally Great Chin, a term often interpreted by many modern scholars as referring to the Roman Empire, was sent by the prefect of Jiaozi to the ruler Sun Xian, 222 to 252 CE, of the state of Wu, who was asked to provide a report on his native country and its people. After being gifted men and women, boys and girls, 10 of each, Qin Lu returned home. It is stated in the passage directly preceding this anecdote that the merchants from Dachin frequently visit Funan, a prefecture of the Mekong Delta, as well as Renan and Jizhou. But few of the inhabitants of these southern frontier states have traveled to Dachin. If it is accepted that Dachin does in fact refer to the Roman Empire in this instance, and that this comment is directly connected to the anecdote about Qin Lun, then we would on the face of it appear to have attested I hate that word, testimonies of supposed frequent travel by merchants from the Roman Empire to the areas along the coast of what is today Vietnam during the early 3rd century CE, possibly also from the end of the 2nd century CE. However, this seems an unlikely proposition given our understanding of the levels of the direct participation by Roman merchants in the Indian Ocean trade at this time, as is clear from the intensity of the occupation of the key Egyptian Red Sea ports. Now, there is a greater context to this reading as to the location of Da Chin, so I will link it so that you guys can read it yourself. If you want to, comment 1. If you want me to read the whole thing, I'll just upload it as a full reading. I have it, but I'm not going to read it this time because I don't know what people want, but let's just see one of their conclusions about what Da Chin is. The products of Da Chin. Discussions of the products of Da Chin perhaps has more pertinence with the regards to Indian Ocean trade. McLaughlin, working on the assumption that the Weili and Hao Hanshu faithfully reproduce information appearing in its original reports regarding these texts as being able to provide information about Roman products reaching the Far East. The former text associating Da Chin with some 59 products. He even suggests that many of the goods, which are clearly from other regions such as Arabia and India, were reprocessed and re-exported items from Roman workshop. On the face of it, it might be tempting to accept this premise, at least in part, since some of the products listed in our Chinese text do in fact derive from the Roman Empire. These include gold, silver, various base metals, glass, red coral, asbestos, cloth, real gar, storax, orpiment, and saffron. A few of the products, like red coral, were in fact regarded across many cultures, while storax and glassware appear to have been particularly appreciated in China. It might even be tempting to give some credence to the claim made in the Weili about the people of Da Chin reworking imported Chinese silk and reselling it at a profit. This is because what seems to be corroborated evidence appears in a few Greco-Roman sources. Pliny mentions women of the empire dividing threads of silk and then reweaving them to make a lighter, more gauze-like fabric. A practice also briefly alluded in Lucian's Pharsalia. Furthermore, there is a reference to the edict of maximum prices to a variety of reworked silks, including dyed and embroidered products. However, there are reasons to be more circumspect in the case of the notions of reworking woven silk products. Hildebrandt observes that any such product would damage the fabric. She argues that instead Lucian may have alluded to a diaphanous, purple dyed silk gown that was formerly a plissé fabric but stretched to make it transparent, and that Pliny was talking about the unraveling of cocoons, not woven fabrics. Furthermore, reasons for doubt also derives from the fact that Da Chin need not automatically designate peoples from the Roman world. The existence of reasonably developed silk industry in India in the early historic period should at least give us pause about whether the claim made in the Weili necessarily reflects accurate Chinese knowledge of Roman practices regarding silk processing with regard to the range of items listed as products of Da Chin. Most of these, as noted, clearly derive from the regions such as East Africa, ivory, rhinoceros horn, southern Arabia, frankincense and myrrh, the Persian Gulf regions, pearls, India, Duna, rock crystal, pearls, ivory, carnelian, and Southeast Asia, rather than attempt to claim that all of these items were repossessed and re-exported from the Roman Empire, it seems more plausible to suggest that they were conflated with Dachin as a powerful semi-utopian kingdom in the distant west, and that these authors were simply not in the position to clearly distinguish the origins of these products. This confusion and lack of clarity about the origin of particular imported products is not an unusual phenomenon. For example, there was a persistent and a erroneous belief repeated in Greco-Roman literature that cinnamon, cassia, and nard came from Arabia. It may also be possible to draw certain parallels with the list of products from Dachin given in the Wele and Ho Hanshu with Buddhist ideas that made their way into China in Mahayana Buddhism. There is a concept of seven treasures. In the Great Event, an important Mayahan text, these seven consist of crystal or quartz, pearls, lapis lazuli, gold, silver, red coral, and agate or coral. Later texts substitute rubies or diamonds. These items became features of Buddhism. Heavens and also came to constitute elements of the immortal trees of Taoist paradise. All of these items are listed in the Wele with the exception of lapis lazuli, but these could be understood as being subsumed within the various semi-precious gems category. This appears similarly to be the case with the slightly less extensive list in the Hao Hanshu. Before we finalize the last part of this reading, let's summarize what we've been reading, which is first of all, let's just look at the arguments which are solid, which are you can't conclude from the Chinese, who in the beginning we read had never even gone past the Middle East, that they know for a fact that the people that they're talking about are from the Roman Empire. Secondly, we can't conclude from this that there are other people who did not come from different regions and land. Now, Dachin meaning the Great Qin, which they're talking about, well, modern people interpret it as Rome or the Roman Empire. Here's the problem, many problems. One, these are several different times. So the Roman Empire shrank and grew and shrank and grew. So how could they know specifically which parts it was? But also the materials that came from several different locations. That came from India, China, India, Rome, Africa, the Middle East. How can you conclude that, and even Southeast Asia, how can you conclude that all of those were taken from the Romans? The answer couldn't be more clear. This is actually evidence of, if they are correct about what they're saying, this is evidence of multiple people traveling from multiple different places and entering China from Southeast Asia, which of course the Romans would have very little access to those regions, from Africa, from the Middle East, and from India by boat traveling. And in fact, this summarizes the Indian Ocean. And in fact, there's more writings about Dachin and what the people might have looked like, and the fact that some of them wore gold and all this other stuff, which we will not look at today. But still, there's more information about this. And that Dachin, that's been taken to mean the Roman Empire, because it later meant, those specific regions, especially with Justinian. Now, another thing that, I'm going to contradict a video I made recently, actually the previous one, is that it is possible that Justinian was the first to used the silkworm, but it's also possible that other people outside of Justinian's people figured out the silkworm because they traded with China directly. Okay, continue reading, which actually mentions bluish greenish gems, quite possibly referring to lapis lazuli. While Dachin was understood as a terrestrial empire, the fact that it was in the far west near the location where paradise was situated, at least in certain religious philosophical creeds like variants of Buddhism and Taoism, may explain why these products were associated with this empire. The suggestion is, of course, speculative. The next title heading is Dachin as a nebulous concept, and this is basically their conclusion. Given the contested debate in modern scholarship regarding exactly what Dachin refers to, and the fact that many mythic religious concepts are associated with it, we should consider questioning whether our Chinese authors had a precise, consistent, and coherent sense of this land. In consequence, this has obvious implications for the way in which we understand the reference to the merchant from Dachin frequently sailing to Vietnam, mentioned in the Liang Shu. The notion that a term that designates an other ethnic cultural group might be vague, imprecise, and fluid, open to being understood differently from context to context, should not be surprising. The type of problem has a number of historical parallels. For example, the term Yavana in origin appears to have been used in parts of India to designate Greek-speaking peoples. It generally assumed that the Persian term for Ionians, Ioana, was transmuted into the Prakrit Yona and Sanskrit Yavana. However, by the early to mid-centuries of the first millennium CE, it appears to have become much broader in meaning, not necessarily just designating Greek speakers, and could be understood in different terms, as appears to be in the case of Sangam literature of the Tamil cultures, as well as inscriptional evidence from the Deccan and the island of Socotra. Similarly, the Greco-Roman designation of Ethiopians, a people that are broadly associated with Northeast Africa, could, depending on the period and the context, be associated with the Meroitic kingdom, or by the 3rd century, if not earlier, with the Aksum kingdom. Similarly, some authors, classical authors, conflate India and Ethiopia, and at least by the late antique period, the term India, sometimes distinguished between India Major and India Minor, could include regions like East Africa. This potential ambiguity should be borne in the mind when considering the description of Dachin and its people in textual sources. Now, the one I know the most about that they make there, the two of India Minor and India Major, where sometimes they refer to East Africa, but there's also the Mesopotamians who sometimes they definitely made the reference to some places which were India later as Africa, but I forgot the name of them. I'll look it up. But if you look at also Ethiopia, the word Ethiopia, though it meant East Africa in some cases, this was because they ran into those places first. But you will see that there are other Greco-Roman sources that call the Ethiopia the entire continent of Africa. In some cases, they call only the parts south of the north, obviously, as Ethiopia, and then the lands above, they have their own names, especially the parts that they had conquered. Also, sometimes they refer to Egypt as Ethiopia, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they say Ethiopia, not referring to Egypt or outside of Egypt. One author, one who was very ignorant, also claimed that the Ethiopians come from India, and that there was a land somewhere in the middle of India and Africa, and they separated from that place. Now, obviously, knowing genetics today, it's a very ignorant thing to say, and was probably born of the fact that Indians and Africans have similar skin color. Back to the reading, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that Chinese historical texts, as has been discussed, usually followed their predecessors when describing foreign countries and situations. Indeed, it is of interest that the texts dating several centuries after the initial composition of the Weile and Han Hanshu appear to transpose a number of ideas connected to Daqin, with Fulin, the latter usually being interpreted as referring to Byzantine, meaning some of the descriptions and designations repeated in later texts may represent fossilized ideas, which can become distorted in the process of conflation of earlier, sometimes more accurate predecessors. This adds a further layer of complication when thinking about knowledge transfer and how much can genuinely be taken as reports that resulted from trade contacts. He goes on to say, ultimately, it is not my intention to claim that these early Chinese texts have no use in the study of Indian Ocean and South China Sea networks of exchange, commercial and cultural, of the early mid-first millennium CE. However, I hope to have demonstrated that these reports need to be treated with a great deal of circumspection. Now, of course, Eastern sources aren't the only sources that we have for Africa. We have, of course, Ptolemy, who wrote in his geography about Rapta and Aramata, where spices are taken and shifted around the world, which Aramata is in the Horn of Africa. Rapta is somewhere inside or in Central Africa or Central East Africa. It's never been found, but there are some clues to where exactly it is. We know it's not in the north. We know it's not too far to the south because they mentioned the Zanj regions after this, which are in the south. And this is what he had to say. Concerning the voyage from Aramata to Rapta, Marinus tells us that a certain Diogenes, one of those who were accustomed to sail to India, having been driven out of his course, and being off the coast of Aramata, was caught by the north wind, and after having sailed with Troglodytica on his right, came in 25 days to the lake from which the Nile flows, to the south of which lies the promontory of Raptum. He tells us also that a certain Theophilus, one of those who were accustomed to sail to Azania, driven from Rapta by the south wind, came to Aramata on the 20th day. In neither of these cases does he tell us how many days were occupied in the actual sailing, but merely states that Theophilus took 20 days and Diogenes, who sailed along the coast of Troglodytica, took 25 days. Now, I want to remind you that when we're talking about Rapta, we're not talking about any place outside of Africa, or even when we talk of Aramata, we're not talking about a place outside of Africa. We're talking about Africa proper. And there's a reason why I'm saying this. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there's so many references of geography, of location, that make it obvious where these locations are. For example, he mentions Arabia Felix, which is about Yemen. And from there, he says opposite that there's Aramatica or Aramata, which is in there. And then all of a sudden, he says you move westward, you get to Rapta. You move southwards, you get to the Zanj regions. So it's unlike the older version in Egypt when they mention the areas of the Horn of Africa, where they leave it up to interpretation, where some people have taken it to mean maybe Saudi Arabia or some other place. In this case, they mean definitely these specific locations. And the fact that they mention empires in those regions, stone walls, clothes being weaved in those regions, tells you how old the tradition is. But of course, this is not about clothes or any of that. It has to do with the connection between India and Dachin and all these other places in history that communicated with each other. Well, we can see here that there were some people from as far as Europe who did go to India. And of course, from the Chinese sources, we know that people from the West, meaning Africa, west of China, they did go to those regions. So we have multiple sources from multiple parts of the world that detail multiple people traveling multiple times from one place to the other. We even in this book of Ptolemy, we have them documenting boats traveling from Arabia Felix all the way into Rapta, and from Rapta to Arabia Felix. So probably the most annoying thing about this history is not that it is lost or unknown, it's that it's so easy to piece together, yet still people look at it like a vague, because of course when people say when did trade between India and Africa outside of Egypt start, they say about the 7th century. There's proof everywhere that that couldn't be the case, and that it started somewhere. If you were being charitable to the other side, you would say 7th century BC. And of course, like I said, trade does not always mean you want stuff that you don't have in your own land, but instead you might value, for example, rhinoceros horns. Why are rhinoceros horns being taken there? Well, it might have to do with preserving their rhino instead of, getting rid of their rhino. If there's a bunch of people who are okay with getting rid of their rhino specifically, then they can keep the horns. Oh yeah, and finally I want to say about the silk thing. Like I said, I made a video about it saying that it was Justinian who brought it to these regions and probably brought it to Africa. But again, that's based on specific authors and specific people who say this. We do not know if the people did not discover it in some other way in India, the Middle East, or even Africa. So globalization might have been a thing way before we thought, and that we lost that at some point, but later we brought it back in the strongest way possible. Now, not every region in the world didn't globalize, but what I mean is Europeans. Now, again, the word frequent is a scary word because, of course, oh yeah, that was one of the points I wanted to make. One of the reasons why it seems like there was so many missions to China at the time could explain the fact that it was multiple people from multiple civilizations, and then they think they're coming there a lot of times, when in real life it's different civilizations. Thank you. Oh, subscribe, like, share, everything.